Welcome to another Catholic Family News special report. I am Brian McCall, Editor-in-Chief of Catholic Family News, and I am coming to you this evening to bring you a breaking story from Archbishop Carlo Maria Viganò. We have just published, simultaneously with this video, a lengthy text of the Archbishop on our website, which contains his detailed analysis of the McCarrick affair and the report of the Secretary of State of the Vatican. It is a blockbuster text, and I recommend that you read it. But in this short video, I'm going to try to highlight for you some of the important claims made by Archbishop Viganò in today's text. By way of background, you may recall that on November 10th, we reported that the Vatican had released the long-awaited report on the scandalous affair of former Cardinal Theodore McCarrick, who at one point was the highest-ranked cardinal in the United States of America and has been credibly accused of a vast amount over decades of sexual immorality involving not only the abuse of children, but the abuse and engaged in unnatural sexual activity with seminarians and other adult men. On the same day, we reported that Archbishop Viganò responded in a very brief one-page first initial response to that. Again, you can see that on our website, in which he says, "Before I express myself on its merit, I will take time to analyze its content." So he sort of indicated in that he's going to give us a more detailed explanation of his merit, but in this he had to respond because in an investigation that's supposed to be investigating the criminal, McCarrick, the Vatican basically redirects the attention to Archbishop Viganò, and he appears to be the accused. He is mentioned hundreds of times throughout the report, and they attempt to blame Archbishop Viganò for this scandal of McCarrick and the long decades in which Vatican officials and other prelates covered up his horrible behavior. Archbishop Viganò, as you'll recall, in that one-page reaction called the report fraudulent, right, and said that it is a reconstruction of facts that he calls mystifying. So really his first response was a defense of himself, a sort of explaining that this is outrageous, that he is being blamed, he, the whistleblower, the one that brought all this to our attention, is being blamed for what McCarrick did and for the cover-up. But today we are publishing, as I said, this much lengthier statement of the Archbishop with a little introduction, a written introduction by myself. Here, as you can see, this statement begins. It runs in Word a full 13 pages. So you can take a look at that. In this video, I want to highlight the key things that McCarrick says in this statement. First, he goes through to explain that there are massive inconsistencies in what is supposed to be an unbiased, just give me the facts, right? Just the facts, ma'am, investigation. And in fact, he goes on to show this is not a just the facts, ma'am investigation. It had an agenda. But he said if you were interested in the facts, you would evaluate all of the testimony and evidence. But he points out that although they give great weight to all of the testimony of the buddies of McCarrick, his proteges, and those whose career he advanced, there are many people whose evidence is critical that is not even referenced in the report. Most notably, the victim. The victims, plural. He noticed that the main testimony of James Grind, who was one of the first victims to come out, who's been known since the time of John Paul II, over 20 years ago, finds no place in the testimony. No actual testimony from this one victim and any of the others. Also, the Secretaries of State, Sodano and Bertone, who were at the heart of this, right? They were at the heart of this cover-up. They were there as the Secretaries of State, not even interviewed, not even investigated. So he says, Archbishop Viganò, we are left bewildered by the fact that Monsignor Farrell's testimony, Farrell was a close associate and actually lived with McCarrick, who now claims, oh, I had no idea what he was doing in his bedroom while we were sharing a house. That Farrell's testimony in defense of McCarrick has been reported with emphasis. And he says that this bishop is referred to with the title most excellent. But at the same time, the testimony of James Grind was completely omitted, just as the choice was prudently made, prudently meaning because they wouldn't like what they got, to take not to take a deposition from the Secretaries of State, Bertoni and Sodano. Again, he points this out, how can this be an investigation when you don't investigate and interview the key characters? And he says it's very clear what this report was meant to do. Its underlying goal was not to find the facts, but it was to blame everyone except Jorge Maria Bergoglio, Pope Francis. He says the goal was to blame the deceased, John Paul II, and the neutralized, sort of locked away and hiding in the Vatican, Benedict XVI. So push the blame off on people who can't really defend themselves, as well as we said to blame Archbishop Viganò, as he pointed out in his first intervention. He says, the only one who in the narrative of the Secretary of State cannot be touched by any suspicion, by any accusation, even if only indirect, or by any shadow of cover-up, should obviously be the Argentine, by which he means Pope Francis, obviously. And this is because, as I pointed out in my analysis, one of the key parts of this report is it just flatly denies the detailed testimony of Archbishop Viganò from the summer of 2018, when he tells with incredible detail all the circumstances, how he met Pope Francis, told him there was a file, a thick file on McCarrick, and told him of the imposition of penalties and restrictions by Pope Benedict, and said that there was a real problem with McCarrick. And Francis just flatly denies it, says didn't happen, not at all, and creates this calumnious attack on him. And he says essentially, well, why is Farrell believed, someone who seems circumstantially to have been clearly involved in this, or at least covering it up, and he's considered valid and credible, where the Archbishop himself, Viganò, is dismissed as not credible. He says, even though I am an Archbishop and an Apostolic Nuncio, the only reason I can identify as to why Farrell's words are that Farrell's words confirm Bergoglio's thesis, mine refute it, and demonstrate that it was not only the Bishop of Dallas who was lying. So again, he says they basically only credit testimony that supports the party line, that Bergoglio is not to be blamed, and to blame everyone else. Now, this is where Archbishop Viganò takes his explanation to an even higher level. He says, look, this whole McCarrick report is just part of the worldwide movement he has been denouncing for a year now, what he has termed the deep state and the deep church who are acting in concert. And he says there's some striking similarities between the fraud that has been perpetrated in the past 6-7 months over COVID-19 that has been used to lock down huge parts of the population in totalitarian martial law, effectively. The fraudulent 2020 election, in which it appears an overwhelming landslide of Donald Trump was stolen by fraud, and the fraud of the McCarrick report to cover up and do away with the actual information on what happened, who promoted McCarrick, who covered up for him, and who protected him. And he says these are all very, very, very similar. What he points out about them is the similarity of their approach, that when you have the truth of what happened, right, and the use to which that truth must be made, the sort of agenda of the New World Order, the deep state and the deep church, well, the truth, the reality has to be changed to fit the agenda. So if COVID-19 turns out to be a serious flu, a serious flu that has to be taken seriously, but not an Ebola type disease that kills everybody it touches, well, then you just have to change the reality. You just can't report what COVID-19 really is. If Donald Trump in reality overwhelmingly wins re-election, well, you just have to change reality because it doesn't fit with the agenda of the New World Order. And likewise, the McCarrick situation. You just need to come up with a report that just changes the facts to fit the reality. And then, in the midst of this sort of comparison, he makes a startling claim because he compares even more directly what's going on in the church with what's going on in the fraudulent U.S. election. He explains, if Jorge Maria Bergoglio owes his election to the conspiracy of the so-called St. Gallen Mafia, which included ultra-progressive cardinals in constant and assiduous relationships with McCarrick, if McCarrick's endorsement of the candidate Bergoglio found a hearing among the conclave electors and those who have the power of persuasion in the Vatican, if the resignation of Benedict XVI was in some way provoked or favored by interference from the deep church and the deep state, it is logical to suppose that Bergoglio and his collaborators did not have any intention of letting the names of McCarrick's accomplices leak into the report, nor the names of those who favored him in his ecclesiastical cursus honorum, nor above all, the names of those who in the face of the possibility of a conviction could in some way take revenge. For example, by revealing the involvement of prominent personalities of the Roman Curia, if not of Bergoglio himself. Now, what is he claiming here? He is saying that the reason this cover-up had to happen and why excised from the investigation in the report are the real bad guys, the people that worked on this, and false targets are placed up, like Viganò himself to blame, is because this has been part of a deep conspiracy of the deep church and the deep state to remove Benedict from office and to get Bergoglio elected, because he would be a pope that would bring about this revolution in tiara and cope, to use the reference from the instruction, the permanent instruction, the Alta Vendita of the Freemasons. Now, you may have wondered, what's that reference to St. Gallen Mafia? That is not a conspiracy, it's a factually known group that have admitted what they were doing of high-ranking prelates that met in St. Gallen, Switzerland, to plan for the election of a pope like Bergoglio. If you want more information about that, there's another video that I did with Julia Maloney, a fantastic researcher who's written a book on the St. Gallen Mafia. So please watch that video to get more information on that part of this plot. So he points out that this whole thing is a sham. This McCarrick report says the point must be denounced loudly. The report drawn up by the Secretary of State is an indecent and clumsy attempt to get a semblance of credibility to a gang of perverts and corrupt men in the service of the New World Order. Now, again, he's saying this report is to cover up the evil work of perverts, right? Who he said in the prior quote I read you, in corrupt men who are working at the highest levels of the Vatican itself and likely include Jorge Bergoglio, Pope Francis himself. And that this has all been a sinister plot to redirect attention, just like the media wants to redirect attention away from the fraudulent election and results in America by putting out stories about how Biden won and covering up all the allegations of fraud. Well, if you think it couldn't get any more explosive, it does. Why? Because he goes on to explain, look, if you are seeing fraudulent elections in the United States, he says that's not the first time. And he makes a stunning claim about the conclave in 2013 that elected Pope Francis. So I'm going to read to you the paragraph from his intervention in which he brings up this information. He says, would we be surprised if, after noting the electoral fraud in the presidential election in the United States, someone would even try to manipulate the election of the Supreme Pontiff? And then he goes on to say that on the fourth, quote, on the fourth vote of the second day of the last conclave on the irregularity emerged in the counting of the ballots, which was remedied by a new vote in derogation from the provisions of the Apostolic Constitution Universi Dominici Grigis, promulgated by John Paul II in 1996. Now, what is he talking about here? He's explaining that the rules that govern the election of the Pope can be updated from time to time. The most recently they were updated was 1996 by John Paul II in this document, Universis Dominici Grigis. And it specifies how many times each day the conclave can conduct a ballot and what happens if the ballot is not successful to elect a pope, and regulates these details. What he's basically saying that what happened was there was an irregularity that emerged in the counting of ballots. An irregularity in the counting of ballots, that sounds familiar. So as they counted the ballots, there was some irregularity. What could that mean? Maybe more votes than cardinals? I don't know. He doesn't specify, but says there's an irregularity. And so those ballots were, that it couldn't be used. But they then went forward, right, to have another vote, even though they had exhausted the numbers of votes permitted in balloting committed to be done each day of the conclave. And then Bergoglio was elected. Again, this is stunning. He is here saying that the type of electoral fraud that we've seen in the United States appears, there's at least credible evidence that it could have occurred in the election of Pope Francis. Now, he's not making a legal claim here. I want everyone to be careful, because again, he's been very clear. He is not saying that Pope Francis is not the Pope. So he's not saying that Pope Francis is not the Pope. And to understand that, you have to understand a little bit about the law of the Church. So it's been an established legal principle in the Church that even if there is an illegality or an irregularity in the election of the Pope, that if that's discovered at the time, that it should be thrown out and he's not elected and you keep voting. However, if someone is declared the Pope, accepts the position, and then, this is important, is accepted by the Church, and again, not by every single individual member, but as a moral certainty, the Church around the world acknowledges him as the Pope, that acknowledgement of the Church cures illegalities or irregularities that occurred in the conclave. It's a principle of law to give us certainty as to the identity of the Pope, that if this process of the acknowledgement of the candidate and his acceptance of the role and his acknowledgement by the whole Church occurs, well, then we can no longer go back and say, okay, well, it's invalid, he's no longer the Pope. Even if at the time, cardinals could have said, no, this cannot be the Pope, we do not accept him because of this irregularity. That's very important. And whatever we think about Pope Francis, it's very clear that the Catholic world, we now have been living under the reign of Pope Francis for 7 years now, and the Church is in again a morally universal sense, and not again each individual member, but throughout the world, has sort of said, okay, that's the person who is the Pope. So again, what's really important is the point of Archbishop Viganò here is not to push to sedevacantism, say, well, he's not the Pope, or Benedict, the sort of Francificantism, made up word, but meaning that Francis isn't the Pope, Benedict still is. No, he's been very clear in his response to Catholic Family News this summer. He doesn't believe that. Why is he bringing up then? To say, look, this is all happening as part of this infiltration of the Church and the state, right? That what we see going on, these shenanigans in America, are also what have been going on in the Church. So that's why he brings up this evidence of irregularity there, to show us that this is a concerted effort by enemies of the Church, enemies of all the true, the good, and the beautiful, to transform, to reset, the Great Reset, not just civil society, not just the economy, but the Church herself. And this is where he again links his analysis here to what he boldly proclaimed in June and July of this year, when he made the connections between what he was seeing in terms of corruption and Vatican II. You remember what really got the ire of the mainstream Church against him was that he connected the dots. And he said, what's wrong with the Church today? We have to trace it to its roots. And in June, he told us in his interventions on Vatican II, those roots are in Vatican II. And that's why we need to just essentially get rid of the council, forget about it, consign it to history, and move back to tradition. And he brings up that point again in this letter. He says, the problem is they didn't want a truly independent investigation, because such a truly independent investigation into McCarrick would, quote, confirm what many do not yet dare to admit, namely the role played by the deep church since the election of John the 23rd in creating the theological premises and the ecclesiastical climate that would allow the church to be the servant of the new world order and to replace the Pope with the false prophet of the Antichrist. Again, where is the origin? It's in John the 23rd, the Pope who convened the council. Since that time, notice the two things that are changing: the theological premises and the ecclesiastical climate, doctrine and discipline. That the origin, what really enabled McCarrick and produced a church that is a servant of the New World Order, are these changes that occurred at Vatican II. And these changes, the party that worked for them is the same party that's infiltrating the church today, the deep church. There were the radical modernists who had infiltrated the church. They had been pushed down by Pope St. Pius X. They'd been pushed down by Pius XII again in his encyclical Humani Generis, but they were still there. They were still viruses in the body of Christ, and they came out into the open. They replicated themselves in Vatican II when they took over the council through their devious undermining of the council. And he says that's why they didn't have an honest report, because it would have proved these two changes: the radical change of discipline to guard the traditional doctrine and moral life of the church, and the rejection of traditional premises. Well, what's he talking about? What are these traditional premises? Well, as it relates to McCarrick, he calls a spade a spade. He says the problem is that homosexuality, right, is at the root of what went on with McCarrick. That is an acceptance of it, as a normal just lifestyle, just a choice, and changing the doctrine of the church, which since the Old Testament times has been these are unnatural, intrinsically evil acts that can be tolerated in no way and can be condoned in no way, because they are not only evil, they are intrinsically evil, and they are against nature. Again, many saints have even told us that the devils who tempt to this sin, actually it's a sin that they can't even watch, because often the devils will sort of watch us commit sins in order to sort of revel in what they've done. But this sin is one that, because it is against nature and they still have the nature of angels, even though they've become corrupted, they turn their faces away and can't even watch the sin being committed. But what do they want to change? The doctrinal premise, the theological premise that it's just a choice. It's not that bad, right? And this is what we've seen has come out most dramatically in the pontificate of Pope Francis through Amoris Laetitia, through the Synod on the Youth, that has just been this softening of the Catholic theological premises on this and the acceptance of it. Most recently with Pope Francis's comments in the documentary Francesco that civil union should be recognized. It's exactly the origin of that is in Vatican II, but then also the relaxing of discipline, the rigid discipline of the church as a good mother to protect her clerics and her hierarchy and the laity from occasions of sin, to adopt disciplinary rules that the wearing of the cassock, for example, by one example, that was to help priests to remember their moral obligations and their duty to live up to the teaching of the church. All of that being thrown out in the garbage along with the habits and cassocks of religious and clerics, that all of these things have what led to the culture that produced a McCarrick. And although this isn't mentioned by Archbishop Viganò himself, in my commentary on it, I say that these deep state people have succeeded in getting the acceptance of these things among ordinary Catholics. Earlier this month, on November 2nd, the Pew Research Group produced a study on the acceptance by Catholics of quote-unquote gay marriage. So this chart shows the percentage of Catholics in each country who favor or oppose allowing gays to, quote, legally marry, to be acknowledged legally as married. And again, if you had taken this before the council, it'd be close to 100%, right? It was just all Catholics knew, no, the church says that's not possible. Well, look at these numbers, right? Netherlands, 92%, right? Spain, 75%. Again, accept this. France, 74%. United States, better than Europe, but 61%, more than a majority of U.S. Catholics say, yes, that's fine. Now, interestingly, countries that are 50% or below, that are sort of still bad, 50%, but are much better, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Croatia, Poland, Hungary, Latvia, Belarus, Lithuania, Bosnia, Ukraine. That's amazing. It's all Central Eastern Europe and mostly former communist countries. That's really interesting to me that they are sort of closer to maintaining good old Ukraine, only 6%. Again, this destruction of the Western European U.S. lay Catholics' belief. They have accepted. Why was McCarrick possible? Why was his horrible behavior possible? Because a majority of Catholics just accepted this as a normal, acceptable lifestyle. They may not do it, say, I might not do it myself, but it's not theologically impermissible. And again, outstanding. Now, he makes one final point I want to emphasize in his discussion that has not really been commented on very much, and it goes beyond the report. I mean, he sort of says, well, the Vatican's patted itself on the back, or we did a great job, we punished McCarrick. He says, actually, there was no punishment at all here, the McCarrick, and he reminds us of some critical facts. He says, yes, McCarrick was laicized. He was reduced to the lay state. He lost his cardinal. Oh, this sounds horrible. But he points out, he says actually that, well, no, that was done through an administrative procedure that prevented him from actually going to jail. He's maybe wondering, the Vatican does have a jail. There is a criminal law of the church that can result in criminal penalties, like imprisonment. In fact, he cites an example of a priest who engaged in pornography who was sentenced to prison in the Vatican prison. And he says, so what actually happened here is interesting. Rather than a harsh punishment on McCarrick, he said, which could have come out of a canonical trial, Bergoglio and his henchmen decided that it'd be better to have it done through an administrative proceeding that simply made him a layperson, reduced him to the lay state, so-called laicization. Well, he says this is kind of hardly a punishment when you compare it to what he should have gotten, right? He should have been reduced to the lay state and given a criminal punishment. So I'm going to read to you what Archbishop Viganò says about this. And again, this is something I haven't really seen many other people point out. So he basically says, instead of being put into Vatican prison for his crimes, McCarrick, quote, resides in a secret locality where he can continue undisturbed in his paradiplomatic activity on behalf of the deep state and the deep church in the anonymous guise of a layman. And that's a really interesting way to put this. He sort of says it's not really a punishment at all. I mean, this is somebody who's clearly not a prince of the church in a positive sense. Somebody who doesn't take his oath as a bishop seriously. So what does he care if he's not, okay, he lost the external pomp of being a cardinal. But what he says, actually, what did he gain? He can now be a more anonymous operative of the deep state and deep church because he's not in prison. He's just sort of off being kept in a nice place in a secret location where he can lurk in the shadows doing more dirty work for the deep state and the deep church. And that's really a fascinating take on this, that rather than being punished the way he should, he was just sort of given a low profile so he can go around doing these, doing what he did before, but out of public spotlight. So it's a fascinating commentary on the whole McCarrick affair. It pulls all the pieces together. As I've said in so many prior videos, Pope Francis has a favorite phrase in his sort of tree-hugging echo nonsense, where he tries to sort of, do this pantheistic view of love of nature. He had this phrase that was used a lot in the Amazon Synod, everything's connected, by which he means in sort of a weird, Star Wars, the force is the life force that moves through all of us in a sort of weird pantheist way. That's how he meant it. But I think we can use it in a different sense, right? All these dark forces are connected. These children of darkness are all connected. Why? Because their ultimate leader is the enemy of Christ. The devil himself is the power behind all of this. And he manifests himself in the deep church, the deep state, the US election, Theodore McCarrick and his evil network, in communist China, all over the world. But he tells us that we must recognize this, but we must not lose hope, right? Because he says ultimately they will be destroyed. Right? Because the real victim, the ultimate victim, in addition to all the victims that have been hurt by these evil men, the victim that is also there, who will not go unavenged, is the spouse of Christ, the immaculate bride of Christ, the church herself, the body of Christ, the spouse of Christ, the church. That Christ will not stand by forever and allow his church to be so disfigured and dishonored by these evil men. Viganò says in the sort of closing part of his letter, quote, "In all of this, however, our adversaries forget that the church is not a faceless collection of persons without faces who blindly obey mercenaries, but rather a living body with a divine head, our Lord Jesus Christ. To think of being able to kill the spouse of Christ without the spouse intervening is a delusion that only Satan could believe possible." And he goes on then to compare this to the same delusion Satan had at the crucifixion. The devil was deluded in thinking by killing Christ on the cross he would triumph, when in that very moment of delusion Satan was defeated. Likewise, the same delusion Satan and his forces are falling for, that they can grind down the church by the evil work of such men as Theodore McCarrick and Jorge Maria Bergoglio, Pope Francis, who were on the wrong team, right? Who are using their offices in the church to advance the evil children of darkness. But in that very moment when the church seems at her utter crucifixion, at her utter worst, is when that will actually be the moment of the defeat of the children of darkness by the children of light. And our Lord will resurrect the church once again. We must firmly believe that with all of our strength. We must pray unceasingly that our Lord will shorten these days that if not shortened, even the elect may be deceived. We must pray with all our heart that this will happen, that the forces of darkness will be unveiled, and that this great resurrection of the church, and all throughout history, so goes the church, so goes the world. If the church is resurrected, along with that, hand in hand, our civil society, our nations will be resurrected under Christ the King. So let us keep up our prayers, our sacrifices, our mortifications. Pray particularly, continue the prayer of Archbishop Viganò, that these prayers he's given us, his prayer for our country, for America, and also the prayer that we've been promoting here, the very short prayer for the confounding and division of Marxists and our enemies. Again, you can find that on our website. Please continue to pray that. Pray with your children. Pray, remember your daily rosaries. That is our job as foot soldiers in this great biblical confrontation, as Archbishop Viganò has characterized it. So that's my brief report on the lengthy analysis of Archbishop Viganò on the state of the church, the McCarrick report, and the deep church and the deep state. Again, you can see it at our website. You can read the full report as well as my written commentary. Thank you for your attention in this special report. I hope you've enjoyed it, and look forward to seeing you in our weekly news roundup and in our future special reports. Thank you, and God bless you.
Ite missa est, alleluia, alleluia.